Growing up in an African household, because I did a master's and didn't end up at a doctorate, I'm still a black sheep. And so I'm really grateful that you could say I was a maverick. I hope my mother's listening online to know that I've got somewhere despite not going to the end of my academic journey. First of all, good morning, everyone. I think this conversation is so important given the timing of one, where we are from an ecosystem, but more importantly, where the global macro context and how it influences technology really is today. And so what I hope to do for the next 15 minutes is to give you a high level of the state of technology in Africa, but also grounded in the global context, and hopefully give some green shoots of what to expect for the year to come. As was briefly mentioned by our MC, who still has a job, I am an investor at Brigham. We're a Pan-African fund, but also investing across Europe. We manage just over 700 million euros and have probably now just over 100 portfolio companies around the world. And so that's the lens in which I share the insights. Now, clicker does work. Awesome. And so my brief was around the ecosystem within Africa, and so I'll use that as a point of departure. But as I briefly mentioned to you, it's important to ground the African context in the global context. And I think 2024 has been quite a year. I think definitely from the geopolitical side, what we did see was that in a number of major economies, we did see a number of elections take place from the US to the UK, to India, to Japan, and lots of change there in terms of ideological beliefs. In the same vein, we still have the overhang of conflict both in the Ukraine and in the Middle East, which I think definitely has implications for investor uncertainty and how best to deploy capital within the tech ecosystem. Similarly, we've also seen that for most of last year, many of the central banks actually maintained fairly high interest rates. And what that typically means on the venture side is that there's less risk appetite for more riskier investments such as angel and seed investments. And that hasn't been helped by something which we talk about a lot in this ecosystem around fundraising drought. But the same thing is true globally, where the reality is there have been less IPOs taking place. And ultimately what that means is there's constrained liquidity for VCs to be able to then actually give that money back to their LPs and ultimately recycle that. And so what you did see was that many VCs globally struggled to raise. And actually in 2024, the new funds being raised by VCs was half of that of the year prior. And so definitely seeing that knock-on effect from a macro perspective and how things ultimately do result in where things land. I think in the same vein, what we saw during COVID was a increase in overhiring within the big tech companies, but then coupled with the general macro environment last year, we did see that global tech laid off over 150,000 people. Now, the challenge is that's an incredibly large number. And the question is, where did those people go? How do they add value to the ecosystem? The good thing is, often when you look at these global numbers, it looks at more big tech, and so hopefully startups are hiring a lot more aggressively to cover that. But as we'll find out shortly, it is still fairly difficult for startups. And the reality is that is really impacting things in that particular way. I think the final point from a global perspective before I get into Africa is to then focus on what we saw in the VC landscape. And the US dominated. I think US share, as you'll see on screen, was near 60% of global VC that was deployed and raised last year. And this is the highest it's been in over 10 years. With a big skew driving that because of this resurgence of AI mega deals. Think about OpenAI, XAI, Waymo. I mean, we also Google acquiring Wiz last week. And so definitely with the US at this point in time really leading the AI conversation, what we are seeing is that they are really taking up the lion's share of funding. And ultimately there's a resulting, come off in terms of the rest of the world and how we see things there. So that's the global picture. But what does that mean for Africa, and what have we seen in the African context? So the reality is Africa was a challenging year. And depending on the numbers you look like, as I used to say in my consulting days, it's directionally correct. The reality is that we did see a big drop-off in deals being funded within the African context, a drop by almost 25% year on year, with an actual aggregate decrease in the amount of funding that did take place. And yes, within the African context, the reality is that, as you'll see on the side, is that in the big economies, there was a switching up, but the reality is there was a general reduction. But Nigeria did see a slight increase. But the reality is that VC is still down on the number of deals that were ultimately done within the ecosystem, with almost half the number of deals, particularly in the early stage, coming through, which is a telling sign because, as you know, it's the early stage businesses that are funded today that end up becoming those unicorns and decacorns. Touch wood, I need to find wood. Okay, this looks like wood. Decacorns in the ecosystem in the coming years to come. And so I think it's important for us to realize that there is a chain effect of what we see last year and how that will impact things going forward over a period of time. But that being said, I think there is still hope and some resilience. I think I was reading a Africa Development Bank report the other day, and they had predicted in 2024, and I think we got there, was about 3.8% real GDP growth within Africa, and they expect that this year that will be 4.2%. So there is directionally correct in terms of where we're going at the macro level, and that, for context, is above many of the other global geographies, other geographies around the world. So we actually are bucking the trend there at a macro level. Also in the same vein, we are seeing a resurgence, or rather a rise of venture debt, which I think is very interesting because as the equity gap has pulled back, we are seeing a rise of venture debt into the ecosystem. And that has also helped then to almost bridge that divide. And also seeing an influx of secondary funds, more so in the US. So in the US, last year alone, there was about $100 billion raised for secondary funds. And so that's essentially where you're buying out someone's position in a company without necessarily new capital going into the business. So it's almost like a secondary ecosystem being developed in that particular way. So cautiously optimistic looking at the year ahead, but 2024 was rough, to call a spade a spade. If you look at who's actually been betting on Africa, and I think I really like this visualization, not only because there's Brigger in the background, so shout out. We announced our $70 million fund last year as well, but also seeing a lot of activity in the early stage, with Renew Capital really coming in strong. Oh, okay, that doesn't present so well. Sadly, I think but either which way, Renew Capital did about 25 deals, Launch Africa did about 19, and so there are still investors who are betting on and continue to invest in Africa. What's exciting for me as well is seeing the number of new funds, both across venture and across private equity, but in the same vein, you are seeing that many of those PE players are starting to do a bit more late-stage venture and growth, which is good because ultimately it gives a better spectrum of what capital can look like for a startup over that particular journey. If you think about the growth sectors in the African context, I think the story of Fintech has been well told, but Fintech's dominance must not be understated. 60% of the funding that was received in Africa last year went to Fintech. Now, that was up from 37% the year before. So Fintech is coming for the win. Naturally, there are a number of large deals that have taken place, but the reality is the number of large deals has declined. So in 2023, there were about, call it 7 late-stage deals, how you want to define that. Last year, there were only 2. So things are changing from that perspective, but Fintech definitely does remain dominant from that perspective, seeing both an increase in deal count, but also in the actual number of the actual value invested. Similarly, climate tech has had a mixed experience, and that's by virtue of there being, yes, there's been a increase in the number of deals, but we're not seeing that same level of deal value come through, particularly when you compare it to what you're seeing globally, where you're seeing more, again, with AI, climate tech, and infrastructure coming to the fore. But ultimately, what we see in Africa is Fintech remains dominant when thinking through exactly what that means for the ecosystem and where the money's actually going. Now, it's important to see what does that mean from what we've seen, and what do the new rules look like for venture capital and the tech ecosystem more broadly within the African context. And so I want to just quickly cover off, what we have seen and what we do and what we expect to see. So the reality is, in early stage funding, as I briefly mentioned, there was a 43% decline, particularly in that early stage within Africa. And so that does raise questions about what the implications are for that going forward when you think about the ecosystem. In the same vein, regulation and regulation uncertainty hasn't helped us. What we saw, for example, in Kenya was with some of the tax regulation they put in place on the digital side, so more relevant to us, there's a 1.5% tax brought on local digital platforms. But in the same vein, we also saw that there was a value-added tax to essential goods. And that was what we saw ultimately led to a lot of the civil unrest within the UK, within Kenya, and ultimately President Ruto, as a part of that reaction, was actually forced to look at budget cuts. Even in South Africa, lots of conversations around how we think about exchange control taking place as well. And ultimately, the question is, how can we enable regulation to make things more conducive for tech and tech innovation more broadly in Africa? Some questions to be had there. I think the exit conversation has been well-versed, but again, very limited opportunities for exits that are really taking place. The reality is, in Africa, 1 of 20 investments in the tech space actually results in an exit. That is almost half of what you see, particularly in India, but then it's a fifth of what you see in Latin America. And so the reality is that we need to create that liquidity so we can recycle that back into the ecosystem and continue to invest. And I think that's still something that is very true. And it's the final one comes down to the high borrowing costs. I think ultimately what that relates to is that ultimately the tech companies are unable to get affordable funding. And so yes, in Africa there has been an increase in debt, and so it's probably over $1 billion worth of debt that was issued. But the reality is that could have been so much more if, for example, we're able to bed down things like inflation, the currency fluctuations, and those sorts of things that ultimately impact one's appetite to take debt kind of risk. But that being said, I think what we can expect to see going forward is a slight shift and change when you think about it more broadly. I think definitely looking to 2025 and hopefully 2026 is definitely the resurgence of international investors in the ecosystem. The reality is that Africa still provides or can provide a good risk-adjusted return if one invests correctly in the right sectors and also comes along as a value-add investor versus just capital. And so I think we'll definitely see that resurgence, at least we anticipate to see so in 2026. In the same vein, as I briefly mentioned, this growth in venture debt, which we're seeing globally, but we'll definitely start to see more of in Africa, where essentially we're providing more than just equity into companies, thinking about revenue-based lending, thinking about mezzanine finance. And this is true not only in venture and tech. I mean, you're seeing it in the private equity space, where you're seeing the rise of mezzanine funds as a bridge between typical private equity and what you typically call your senior or subordinated debt. And so I think that's something that's very exciting to look forward to. And I think as founders in the room, starting to think through what kind of capital is right for your business and when, given the profile of your cash flows and your revenue and so forth. So something to think about that. And then also one around the sector shift. I don't think fintech will stop dominating the landscape. But the reality is, I definitely am seeing shifts in the conversations where I'm seeing more interest in infrastructure, which if you asked me 5 years ago, if it wasn't asset-like tech-driven, it wasn't going to happen. So definitely seeing a shift towards infrastructure. But more importantly, I do think that, one, climate tech will definitely continue to grow after the mix 2024. But I think more importantly, AI will continue to also grow its share within the African portfolio, similar to the global portfolio. And I think what I really liked about seeing things like DeepSeek come to the fore and question the dominance of what we're seeing in terms of US AI is that we can think through what developing/emerging market solutions look like to the adoption, production, and ultimate consumption of AI. And so I think we'll definitely see a sectoral shift there over time. I think the question comes down to in what shape or form, and that comes down to the founders. So #no pressure, but I think there's definitely something that we can do there. And then finally, I think, no man is an island, to quote, I guess, the English poet of the 16th century. But I think often as local investors, we don't do enough together. And so I think definitely you'll see more support from local investors coming together and forming networks. I think historically, there were cabals of people. If you were in South Africa, it was Stellenbosch. If it was in Lagos, there was a certain group of investors that worked together and thinking through how that will change. And so I think definitely the new rules for African startups and the ecosystem will definitely see that transition. I think to bring it together, the question then is, who's responsible for the future? I'd say spoiler, but it's fairly obvious. Everyone. And I think all of us have different roles to play in achieving that. And I want to start with the founders because ultimately they're the real heroes in everything that we do in this ecosystem. But I think it's incumbent. See, I want to say us as founders, but I don't know why. These days, when I go to events, they keep on saying I'm an investor, not a founder, but I feel like I'm still a founder. So us as founders, let me own that. We actually need to be able to, one, build capital-efficient businesses And by capital efficient, because remember, every investor wants to know that if I give you $1, what can that do within your business? So don't think capital efficient means I'm asset light. Think about what $1 or a rand or shilling spent in your business actually means. And also importantly, build businesses with strong fundamentals and ultimately think about profitability from day one. And so be intentional by doing that. So just build better businesses or just be lekker when you build. But just think about that more intentionally. I think in the same vein, I want to think what corporates and accelerators can do. I think corporates and accelerators play a very key role, both in terms of bridging the early stage gap in terms of grants and partnerships. But corporates, I think, play two important roles. One is by taking a chance and actually buying services from startups. I know it sounds like it's far-fetched, but I think it's something one can definitely try to do and think through how you bring SMEs into your supply chains and procurement. And I think on another one is, so Google acquired Wiz for $32 billion, and that is very important. Yes, it was a 5-year journey for a cyber tech startup from Israel to get to where it got to. I was reflecting, so a friend of mine's at Sequoia, and he was saying that in their Series B, the valuation they came in at on Wiz was $500 million. So as founders, when you're raising money and the investor says the valuation is too high, just say it's less than 500 million, and therefore they're getting a bargain. But to come back to the corporates, I still believe that corporates can also play a role for exit pathways for founders and companies. And I say exit, but let me say a continuation of the journey, because a startup doesn't stop when it's acquired. The journey continues, but in a different form. And I think corporates can actually play a role in actually acquiring businesses and helping them continue to grow. And the same way, think about Google, Wiz was their biggest acquisition ever. And so I think hopefully that's a trend we can learn from around how we support startups. And then thinking about the government role, I think government has different hats and different levers it can play. And the reality is government has been a funder, it's been a buyer. I think in this particular context, it's about setting the rules of the game so it's conducive for, one, funders to come in, so there's clear, concise regulation and knowing where things particularly land, and ultimately creating a conducive business environment so SMEs don't get stifled because they raise money from an international vendor, changes their cap table, and all of a sudden they no longer apply for local regulation around local procurement. I think there's something to be had around that. And I think, finally, I'm looking to you investors, and I see some investors in the front here, I see Aisha, I see Bakang, I see many investors out in the room, so this is to all you guys there, is really thinking through how can we as investors, one, bring more than just funding. I think it's interesting. I was listening to a conversation the other day from Doug Leone, who was the former managing partner at Sequoia before Roelof. And the reality is investors aren't there to be the friends of the founders. We're meant to be there as sparring partners, to be able to have tough conversations over and above providing capital. And it's about our experiences seeing many companies, investing in many companies that we should be bringing to the fore. And so I think as investors, yes, continue to invest, but two, don't be afraid to provide mentorship, to guide your entrepreneurs, and ultimately ensure that your experience and the school fees you've paid help them grow. I think the fear, what I find with many of my co-investors and colleagues is they almost are scared to have a tough chat with the founder because they're worried it's going to have a bad reputation or they're going to get taken out. I mean, so we went through Y Combinator in 2015, and on Bookface, which is our internal platform, there's actually a page where it's like, add your comments about different investors, are they good or bad, don't take their money. And the reality is, the best investors are those that actually can have that tough conversation. So don't be afraid, one, to have that conversation, and to invest more. And to bring that together, I mean, all that's left to say is that, look, Africa, the time is now. I'd like to leave you with the words of the modern poet, John Legend. The future started yesterday, and we're already late.